This is another video about the kitchen sewing table, and this is about as challenging as things can get, literally. Now this is a quilt I've been working on that I need to stitch the binding. I've decided to do a simple fold over binding, and I have it all pinned, and I'm ready to start stitching it. Now the challenge is that it's a little bit bigger than a twin size, but not quite a full. Which means there's a lot of fabric to move around. And the other challenge, this is my Singer Model 1588 as a hand crank. So the reason this is a challenge, and you can see I didn't clear off the whole table. I have other projects, thread, bobbins, but what I did do is make sure that half the table will have the quilt move back easily. You'll also notice that I have it on the going from, I have the machine set up on the long side of the table so that the distance the quilt travels is shorter. So we're going from one side to side and not end to end. Now you would think going end to end would give you a longer area for the quilt to travel back on, and it would, except you're going, with a hand crank, you're going to need to be manipulating it. So if I had done it end to end, I would be standing up a lot and reshifting the fabric way down there. So we're going to go side to side, and I'm going to try and set the camera up so that you can see it from overhead, and I'm just going to do it. I haven't hand cranked a quilt this size in a long time, so this is, like I said, about as challenging as it can get with a hand crank machine, and manipulating the fabric. But in this case, it's the simplest type of sewing. I just have to straight stitch a binding. Now, what I can't really do, or probably won't do, is remove the pins as I go. Normally, I would, but that's going to add, excuse me, that's going to add a lot of time to this. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on the binding of a quilt. So we're going to do this as quickly and efficiently as we can. And I can leave the pins in because I happen to know this machine doesn't mind going over pins. If I were using, say, the Brother or even the 237, they don't like going over pins as much. So let's get to it. Okay, so I have the camera set up, and hopefully it's not going to shift or drop or anything. And I'm not going to do a lot of talking, I'm just going to do some cranking. I need to find my glasses. It always helps when you can see what you're doing. Huh. Well, we don't know where those went, so we'll do it without them. Now, one thing I've done through here is really pin the binding well. And the fact that I'm not going to take the pins out right now means that everything is going to stay exactly where I put it. And this is really going to need to push back that way. And this is the easiest type of hand cranking because you're not manipulating all of the quilt itself, which involves a lot more. If I were doing the whole quilt by hand crank, I would clear off the whole table and I'd be manipulating the quilt all over the place, doing a block at a time. Now I haven't trimmed all of the threads off of here yet. So sometimes you can get a thread stuck. Now you can see I'm stopping every 12 inches or so and shifting this and getting it to move back. It's totally different than having this machine in the treadle, where you can work a little bit more easily because the weight of the quilt pulls it right over the back. And I won't get to that point until I push this back a little bit more. Now this is also the beauty of a hand crank, is that you can do 12 inches at a time. I mean, it's easy to just stop a foot pedal too, but you can do 12 inches at a time. And if you have a chair there, sometimes the chair helps to hold the weight. So it's not high-speed production, which is good sometimes. Now, you see me holding this up like I'm curtsying or something, but if I were working the middle of the quilt in any way, I wouldn't be doing it like this. And because this is just the binding, this is, it's the ending of a quilt, but it's the beginning of the concept of hand cranking. And the biggest piece of fabric you might run into when using a hand crank. And you can tell that even when it drags just a little bit, you have to stop and rearrange it. Now I'm using, this is one of the narrow straight stitch feet, vintage Singer feet. And I'm using the left side of it as like a seam guide to keep the stitching an equal distance from the edge. Now the other wonderful thing about this, and talking about a family table, if you're working on this and the kids are out of school or something, everybody can take a turn at finishing a quilt or quilting, because this is a very simple machine It's already preset, and all you have to do is turn the handle. I mean, if you have girls or boys, husbands, wives, whatever, everybody can sit down and take a turn at making a family quilt. You can make a family quilt for the den, or make a bunch of them for the bedrooms. It can be a family kitchen sewing table. So the worst thing I'm running into here is that the threads that I didn't trim are getting caught on the presser foot. But I have to trim a lot on this quilt, so I didn't want to do just the edge and then go back and have to do it twice. Now the 1588 is a machine that will more or less sew through anything, like a 66 or several of the vintage Singers. So here we are where I need to shift it all. And like I said, this is the easiest example of using a hand crank on a large item, and how many things you can knock over at once if you have a small space. There's actually not much here, elastic, things like that. Now, I find this more relaxing than doing the same thing with an electric. And this is the faster way to do it. Professionally, what I would be doing is removing the pins and using these to trim the threads as I go. So that would take a lot longer, and the way that I just feel like working right now is to just get it stitched and then go through and trim all the threads off and remove all the pins. So that's not even 12 inches of fabric, and it has to be shifted. And I'm not trying to be negative, I'm just pointing out to you that if this were the 1591 and I had the foot pedal, I would be shifting this with two hands and it would go much faster. It's just a whole different way of sewing. So I'll stop there. I think you can tell how convenient or inconvenient you would find that if you were doing this yourself. But I do mean it about a family project. If you have a smaller table, that you can leave this set up and anybody in the house can go by and do some quilting. Hand cranks are wonderful, and they're so easy thought-wise, because you're just cranking, and it just makes the whole thing a very pleasant experience.